Hello again, this is Dr. Kalam again, and we'll finish up Chapter 9 in Week 4 by discussing Learning Outcome number 9.3, which is still dealing with error raters and problems with the performance appraisals. So or as we learn, performance appraisals are a difficult prospect for any manager. Difficult in the fact that you never know how it's going to go. And there are some errors that are common that we need to avoid or we need to be aware of as we embark upon the appraisal process in our organizations, either as a manager and from an HR perspective, understanding how these appraisals should be handled and at both levels. So, and there are some systematic errors in judgment that occur when people evaluate each other. We understand that. And some of those some of those errors that we'll talk about are unclear standards, the halo effect, a central tendency to judge people, some leniency or strictness standards that we need to be aware of, and some biases. So in this brief lecture, we'll talk about those. So let's cover the first set of those problems that we might come across that are most common. So when we talk about unclear standards, we talk about ambiguity or ambiguity traits and degrees of merit that can be cast upon an appraisal process and makes it an unfair appraisal. We want to make sure that when we're appraising somebody that we don't want to necessarily change the standards that are written because we don't want to cross things out and change them, but if there's a standard rating scale or a standard set of requirements on a appraisal, we need to stick with those. But the ambiguity comes when we both don't understand, when the employee and the manager don't understand the same thing. So it's important in the beginning phases, whenever new employees come on board as an HR manager, to get with the hiring managers and make sure part of the orientation for the employee includes a complete overview of the appraisal process so that there's no ambiguity, mixed meanings about what certain performance expectations might be. So another important concept to focus on is the halo effect. And you've heard this before. If you haven't, we'll learn about this in this chapter. But it's essentially the influence of a rater's general impression on ratings of specific qualities, and that can be a problem. Those qualities might be very similar to mine, or some qualities that they hold in high esteem, high regard. Lateness, punctuality, rudeness, politeness, all of those very subjective things. So we need to be aware of those, aware of our own particular impressions of those specific qualities in a person. It can be a problem. So another important concept bias is the central tendency bias, which occurs when supervisors stick to the middle of a particular rating scale and they work outwards from the middle. So what tends to happen, and which is not good, is that everybody ends up with a fairly average rating. So some people might end up high, might end up low, but in the overall they bring them to the middle and everybody ends up as an average. We want to avoid that for obvious reasons. And then there's the opposite end of the scale where we look at leniency and strictness. We don't want to be at either one end of those scales. Supervisors have a tendency to rate everyone either high or low. So we want to avoid that. And then there's this last one, which is an interesting concept, which is the recency effects, which involves letting what the employee has done recently blind the managers or yours or perception of whatever happened previously. So one good event at the end of a appraising process doesn't, or a bad event doesn't paint the true picture of what took place during the whole appraisal period. So there are three other things that we need to really be aware of when we're looking at possible problems with appraisal systems, errors. Is one that about diversity, and it's a sensitive topic for some. HR and hiring managers need to be very close when we talk about these particular subjects and have open discussions about them. But it's a tendency, the problem of bias where diversity is concerned, is a tendency to allow individual differences such as age, race, sex, gender, affect employee appraisal ratings, and that's a problem, for obvious reasons. The next one is the need for fairness. Maybe due to a supervisor's ineptness or the methods inherent unfairness might be a common event. Let's face it, some managers see certain types of behaviors, have favoritism for some people, understand that there are in-groups and out-groups in organizations. People tend to gravitate to a particular supervisor for whatever reason and are close to supervisors. So the need to be fair, although some would say there's no fairness in any employment relationship, but the need to be fair is an overriding obligation of any objective performance appraisal system. And finally, you got to know your employment law. It's important for an employer to ensure that their appraisals are legally defensible. One example would be to wait if an employee is deficient in a particular area of his work, her work, to not enforce some kind of remedial or corrective action to help the employee to become better, to continually to wait until something happens and then invoke some kind of action to terminate might be indefensible. So we're going to make sure that all our actions with regard to diversity, fairness, need to be defensible. Okay, so that's the end of this brief discussion. We talked about the employment situation and a very important concept of dealing with rate error in our appraisal systems. So we'll go on to chapter 10 in this module 4. So stay tuned and see you in a few minutes.